There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name. It's not heartbreak exactly, because heartbreak implies something that started and then ended, something that was yours before it was gone. This is different. This is the pain of someone never being yours in the first place, of feeling something completely real for someone and never saying it, never doing anything with it, just carrying it around privately while life continues normally on the outside, and nothing about what you're going through is visible to anyone, including her. I've heard people talk about right person, wrong time, and I used to think that meant two people who were together and then circumstances pulled them apart. And maybe that's what it means for some people. But for me, it means something slightly different. It means meeting someone where everything about them is right, where being around them feels different from being around anyone else, where the feeling is genuine and specific and not something you talked yourself into, and then knowing from the beginning that it's not going anywhere. Not because she rejected you, not because you tried and it didn't work, but because you could already see clearly that the circumstances weren't going to cooperate, that the timing was wrong, and so you never even got to the starting line. And I want to talk about that specific experience because I don't think it gets enough space in the conversation about love and loss and all the things people go through in that territory. The breakup story has a structure, a beginning and a middle and an end, something to point to and say this happened and then this happened and this is where I am now. What I'm describing doesn't have that structure. Nothing happened officially. There's no story in the conventional sense. Just a feeling I had for a long time about someone who never knew I had it, and the particular weight of carrying something like that and never being able to put it down anywhere. It's a strange kind of grief to explain to people, because when you're grieving a relationship, you can say, I lost something, and people understand what you mean. When you're grieving something that never started, you're saying, I lost something I never had, which sounds contradictory, which sounds like something you should be able to just get over, because there was nothing there to lose. But there was something there. The feeling was there. The time spent with her was there. The version of something that lived in the space between us, unnamed and unacknowledged, was real, even if it never had a category. And losing that, watching the circumstances eventually pull us apart into lives that didn't overlap anymore, felt like a real loss, even though from the outside there was nothing to point to. I never told her. That's the central fact of this whole story, and I want to say it clearly at the beginning rather than building to it, because I think it changes how you understand everything that follows. She never knew. Whatever I felt, however real it was, however much space it took up in my life for the time I was in it, she was unaware of all of it. And I made that choice, or kept making it every time the opportunity came up, for reasons I'll get into later. Reasons that made sense to me at the time and that I've questioned many times since. But the outcome of those reasons is that this is a story about something that only ever existed on one side, something real and significant that lived entirely in me and nowhere else. And that's its own thing. That's the specific experience I want to talk about. Not a love story in a traditional sense. Not two people finding each other and then losing each other. Just one person feeling something genuine for someone else and never saying it, and living with that, with what it cost and what it meant and where it eventually settled. That's the story. And if you've been in something like that, if you recognize this particular shape of experience, then you know already why it's worth talking about. Because it's one of the lonelier things a person can go through, carrying something real and significant completely alone. And I don't think it gets talked about honestly very often. And I've thought about it enough times from enough angles that I'm pretty sure there's no version of this that doesn't hurt. If it was one-sided, you'd grieve the feeling, but at least you'd know it wasn't real for her, which gives you something to hold on to, some reason to let it go. If she felt it too, but nothing came of it anyway, then you're grieving something that was mutual, something that both of you wanted and neither of you got. And that's a different category of painful. You're not just losing a feeling, you're losing what could have been if the circumstances had been different. And that's not a concrete thing you can point to and mourn cleanly. It's this vague shape of a future that never happened. And vague things are actually harder to get over than specific ones because they don't have edges. You can find your way around. I remember talking to a friend about it at some point, much later, when enough time had passed that I could say the words without them costing me too much. And he said something like, "Well, at least you know she was into you too." Like that was supposed to be the comforting part. And I understood what he meant. I get why someone would think that makes it easier. But it doesn't. Knowing she felt it too and that it still went nowhere is its own specific kind of painful that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Because now you're not just sitting with what you lost. You're sitting with what you both lost. And somehow that's heavier, not lighter. The thing about right person, wrong time that I don't think you fully understand until you've been in it is how long it stays with you. A bad relationship. Something that ended because it should have ended. That grief moves. It's painful, and then it peaks, and then slowly it starts to fade, and eventually you can think about it without it costing you much. This doesn't move the same way, because there's no bad version of her to replace the good one with. There's no moment where you remember something she did that makes you feel better about how it ended. The image of her just stays exactly as it was, intact. Because nothing went wrong between you, and an intact image of someone you lost is one of the hardest things to carry. And I think that's what separates this from other kinds of loss in a way that matters. Most grief has a way of softening the thing you're grieving over time. You remember it differently, you see it more clearly, you find the cracks that were always there. With this, there are no cracks. Or if there were, I never got close enough for long enough to find them. And so the version of her I'm carrying around is the best version, the one that existed when everything was still possible. And that version doesn't age and doesn't fade and doesn't give you anything to push against. So, yeah, right person, wrong time. I understand it now in a way I didn't before I lived it. And I wish I didn't, honestly. I wish it had stayed one of those phrases I could roll my eyes at, something other people said about their situations that I could listen to and nod at without knowing from the inside what it actually costs. But I know now, and if you've been here too, if you're listening to this and you recognize what I'm describing, then you know too, and I'm sorry you do. So that's what this is. The girl who was never mine. The feeling I never put into words to the person it was about. The particular weight of right person, wrong time, when right person, wrong time means it never even got to start. I want to try to describe her without making it sound like I'm describing a fantasy, because she wasn't one. She was a real person with a real life and real complications, and I knew that. I was always aware of that. But there was something about her specifically that I haven't found a clean way to articulate, even now. Some combination of things that added up to someone who felt different from anyone I'd met before her. And I thought about how to say that without it sounding like something everyone says about everyone they've ever liked, and I'm not sure I can, so I'll just try to be specific about it instead. The first thing I noticed about her was how easy she was to talk to. And I know that sounds like nothing, like a throwaway line, but I mean it in a specific way. There are people you talk to where the conversation has this slight effort to it, where you're both doing a little work to keep it going, finding the next topic, filling the silences. And then there are people where that just doesn't happen, where you sit down and 2 hours pass and you genuinely didn't notice because nothing about it felt like effort. She was the second kind. Immediately, from the first real conversation we had, she was the second kind. And that's rarer than it sounds, I've learned that sense. Because I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and that specific quality is something you notice by its absence most of the time. She was funny in a way that caught me off guard. Not performing funny. Not the kind of funny where someone is clearly aware they're being funny and waiting to see if it lands. Just actually funny. Like her brain made connections that mine didn't. And she'd say something that I wouldn't have seen coming, and I'd laugh and mean it. And I think that matters more to me than I realized at the time. That specific kind of humor where the person isn't trying, where it just comes out of how they see things. It tells you something about how someone's mind works, and what I found out about hers was that it worked in a way I liked a lot. She cared about things. That's something I noticed pretty early too. Some people move through the world in this kind of surface level way where nothing really gets in, where everything is fine and nothing is that big a deal, and they're pleasant to be around, but you never quite feel like you're talking to anyone substantial. She wasn't like that. She had things she actually cared about, opinions she'd actually thought through, things that bothered her and things that moved her. And when she talked about any of it, you could feel that it was real. And I think that's what made conversations with her feel different. You know, there was actually someone there on the other side of them, not just a pleasant presence, but an actual person with an interior life that she'd occasionally let you see parts of. She was warm in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. Some people are warm in this slightly professional way, like they've learned that warmth is a good quality to project, and they project it consistently at everyone equally. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. But you can tell the difference between that and someone who is actually warm, who actually cares about the people in front of them, whose interest in you is real and not a social habit. She was actually warm. When she asked how you were doing, she was actually asking when she listened. She was actually listening. And after spending enough time around people who perform those things without meaning them, being around someone who just actually meant them was something I felt immediately and couldn't stop noticing. And she was like genuinely beautiful. I want to include that because it's true, and leaving it out would be dishonest. Not in a way that was intimidating exactly, though there was some of that, but in a way that was just there, just part of how she was in a room. Something you'd notice right away and then forget about for a while, because the conversation was too interesting to keep thinking about how she looked. And that combination specifically, where someone is that beautiful and also that easy to be around, where the looks don't create distance but somehow make everything feel more, I don't know, significant. That's a specific thing, and I hadn't encountered it before her. The other thing about her, and this is maybe the hardest one to describe, is that she made me feel like a better version of myself when I was around her. I don't mean that in some cheesy way, I mean it practically. There are people you're around where you feel slightly diminished, slightly less than you are, not because they're doing anything on purpose, but just because of the dynamic, the way their energy interacts with yours. And there are people who do the opposite, who make you feel sharper or funnier or more yourself, who bring something out in you that's actually you, but in a higher register. She did that. Conversations with her made me say things I didn't know I was going to say and think things I hadn't thought before, and I'd leave them feeling like I'd actually used my brain in a way I didn't always get to. I think that's the thing, actually. That's the part that made her feel like the right person in a way that wasn't just about how she looked or how she made me feel or any single thing I could point to. It was the combination of all of it, the way it added up into someone who made the world feel slightly more interesting just by being in it. And I've met people who had some of those qualities and people who had others. But the particular combination she had, in the particular proportions she had it, I haven't found that again. And I'm not saying that to be overdone about it. I'm saying it because it's the honest answer when I ask myself why this one specifically still sits with me the way it does. She was like just a lot, in the best possible way. And I was completely unprepared for what that was going to cost me. There was a specific moment when I realized this wasn't just something casual, and I want to try to describe it accurately because I think the way these moments actually happen is different from how they get talked about. It wasn't a clean realization. There was no single thing that happened that made everything suddenly clear. It was more like I'd been carrying something without fully acknowledging what it was. And then one ordinary moment made it impossible to keep pretending I didn't know. We were just sitting somewhere, nothing special about the setting, nothing significant happening. She was talking about something, I don't even remember what exactly, and I remember watching her and having this thought that arrived so cleanly and so completely that it almost surprised me. Like my own brain had figured something out and was only now telling me about it. The thought was just, I really like her. Not in the vague general sense of liking someone you enjoy spending time with, in the specific sense that means something, in the sense that had weight to it. And the second thought, arriving almost immediately after the first one, was that this was a problem. Not because of anything she did, not because of anything wrong between us, but because I already knew, somewhere underneath everything, that the circumstances weren't going to cooperate. The timing wasn't going to cooperate. And knowing that, and feeling what I was feeling at the same time, was this uncomfortable combination that I didn't really have a way to resolve. I couldn't unfeel it, and I couldn't fix the circumstances. And so I just sat there in that moment with both things at once. The feeling and the knowledge that the feeling wasn't going to be able to go anywhere, and tried to look like a normal person having a normal conversation. I don't think she knew. I'm pretty sure in that specific moment, I kept it off my face. But something shifted in me that day that didn't shift back. Before that, I could talk myself into a kind of comfortable ambiguity, where I wasn't really sure what I felt, and that uncertainty gave me a place to hide. After that, the ambiguity was gone, and I just knew what I knew and had to figure out what to do with that while still being around her regularly, which is its own particular kind of difficult. The thing about realizing you have real feelings for someone in circumstances that can't go anywhere is that it doesn't give you a lot of good options. You can say something and put it out there and deal with whatever happens, which I thought about. You can pull back and create distance so the feeling has less to feed on, which I also thought about. Or you can just keep going the way you were going and carry the feeling privately and hope that either the circumstances change or the feeling fades, which is what I ended up doing, mostly because the other options felt worse. And I want to be honest about the pulling back option because I think it's the one that sounds most sensible from the outside. If you like someone and it can't go anywhere, the logical thing is to put some distance between yourself and the feeling. Stop spending as much time with her. Let it quiet down naturally. And I understood that. I knew that was the rational move. But I also knew that what we had in terms of time spent together and the way those hours felt was something I wasn't ready to give up just to protect myself from a feeling I was already in the middle of. So I didn't pull back. I kept showing up, and I kept feeling what I felt and saying nothing about it, and watching it get bigger rather than smaller, which was probably predictable from the outside, but felt like something I couldn't help from the inside. I remember going home after that day and just lying on my bed staring at the ceiling for a while. Not crying, not falling apart, just this stillness that comes when something has settled into place that you can't unsettle. Like my internal landscape had just rearranged itself around something new, and I needed a minute to adjust to the new arrangement. And the adjustment was uncomfortable, not because the feeling itself was uncomfortable. The feeling actually felt, kind of beautiful in the way that having real feelings for someone always feels a little beautiful, even when it's inconvenient. The discomfort was in the gap between what I felt and what was possible, which was already wide and which I suspected was only going to get wider. I texted her that evening about something completely unrelated, whatever the normal thing was we talked about. And I sat there after sending it, thinking about how strange it is to carry something that big and have it be completely invisible to the person it's about. She got my message and responded and had no idea that a few hours ago, something had shifted in me that was going to make everything slightly more complicated going forward. And there was something almost funny about that, in a painful sort of way. The complete ordinariness of the exchange sitting on top of all this stuff I was now carrying around. That was the moment, that unremarkable Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever day it was, sitting somewhere with her, watching her talk, and having my own brain tell me something I wasn't quite ready to hear. I think about that moment sometimes, not because I regret it, or because I wish it hadn't happened, but because it was the last moment of not knowing. And there's a specific quality to the last moment of not knowing something that you can only see clearly in hindsight. At the time, it's just a moment. Later, it becomes the dividing line between one version of things and another, and you can trace everything that came after back to it. And what came after was a lot. most of which I wasn't prepared for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I've tried to describe who she was as a person, and I want to try now to describe something slightly different, which is what it actually felt like to be around her. Because those are two separate things, and I think the second one is where most of it actually lived. You can describe someone's qualities, their humor, their warmth, the way they think, but the feeling of being in their presence is something else entirely. And it's the part that's hardest to put into words, and also the part that I think explains why this one specifically stayed with me the way it did. The simplest way I can describe it is that time moved differently when I was with her. Not in some abstract, romantic sense, I mean. It practically and literally. I'd show up somewhere to meet her, thinking I had a couple of hours, and then look at my phone, and 4 hours had passed, and I genuinely hadn't noticed the transition. And that sounds like a small thing, but it's actually pretty rare, that specific quality of losing track of time completely because you're too inside whatever is happening to be monitoring it. Most social interactions, even good ones, you're aware of time passing in some background way. With her, I just wasn't. The hours would go, and I'd only find out afterward, and I am around most people. I thought about why that was, and I think it comes down to something about how she listened. There are people you talk to where you can feel yourself editing slightly as you go, making small adjustments to what you're saying based on how you think it's landing, monitoring the response, and calibrating accordingly. And then there are people who listen in a way that makes that monitoring feel unnecessary, where you trust somehow that whatever you're actually thinking is going to be received. Okay, she was the second kind. And when you're around someone like that, you say things you didn't know you were going to say. You go places in conversation you wouldn't normally go. And what comes out is a more actual version of yourself than you usually put in front of people. I noticed I was funnier around her, not trying to be funny, just actually funnier, like the part of my brain that makes connections and finds the angle on things was working better in her company than it usually did. And I think that's related to the same thing. The safety of being around someone who makes you feel like you can just say the thing without running it through a filter first. When you're not managing your output, you have more resources available for actually thinking, and apparently some of those resources go towards humor when I'm relaxed enough to access them. There was also this thing that happened where I'd noticed small details about her that I wouldn't have noticed about someone I was less attuned to. The way she'd get slightly more animated when she was talking about something she actually cared about. Like you could see it physically. The subtle shift in her energy. The way she'd pause before saying something, she was still working out. Like she was giving herself a second to make sure she was saying it right. The specific way she laughed when something actually got her, which was different from the polite laugh and distinguishable if you were paying enough attention, which I was. I was paying more attention to her than I pay to most things. And the level of detail you pick up when you're paying that kind of attention to someone is something you can't really turn off once it's started. Being around her made everything feel slightly more significant than it was. Not in a delusional way. I wasn't sitting there thinking that random Tuesday evening was cosmically important. But there was a quality to ordinary moments spent with her that ordinary moments usually don't have. A walk somewhere. A conversation about something mundane, just sitting in the same space, doing nothing in particular. All of it had a texture that I noticed and that I knew even in the moment I was going to remember. And I think that's actually one of the harder things about this kind of situation, the awareness that you're in something worth remembering while you're still in it. Because that awareness is also the awareness of what you're going to lose. And sometimes it would surface in the middle of a perfectly good moment and put this slight shadow over it that I'd have to push back down and pretend wasn't there. I want to try to describe a specific kind of moment that happened a few times and that I think about more than I'd like to admit. There'd be a point in an evening where the conversation had gone quiet for a minute. Not an awkward silence, just the kind of comfortable quiet that happens when two people are at ease with each other and don't need to fill every second with words. And I'd look at her in that quiet and just feel it, the whole weight of what I felt and what couldn't happen. sitting there in a moment that was otherwise completely peaceful. And she'd be completely unaware of any of it, just sitting there being herself. And I'd be sitting there holding this thing that I couldn't say, and those moments were simultaneously some of the nicest I had with her and some of the most quietly painful. Because that's the specific experience of being around someone you have real feelings for, in a situation that can't go anywhere. You're never just in the moment. There's always this other layer running underneath, this awareness of the feeling and the impossibility of it, and you're managing that layer while also trying to be a normal present person in the actual moment. And the effort of doing both at once is something you get tired of even when you wouldn't trade the moments for anything. And I wouldn't have traded them. That's the honest answer. Even knowing what it was going to cost me, even knowing how it was going to end, I wouldn't have given up those hours for an easier version of things. Because whatever it cost me afterward, whatever I had to carry when it was over, the time spent with her was real and it was good. And it mattered in a way that things don't always matter. And I'd rather have had it and paid the price than avoided it and been safe. At least that's what I tell myself on the days when the pain still feels current. The specific feeling of being around her is something I still carry somewhere, like a sense memory that surfaces occasionally without warning. A certain quality of light in an evening, or a conversation that has that same easy quality. Or sometimes just nothing at all, just something in the atmosphere of a moment that rhymes slightly with how those hours felt. And it's not painful when it happens, not exactly. It's more like this bittersweet thing where the memory of what it felt like is still good, and the loss of it is still present. And both of those things just exist together without resolving into anything clean. Which I think is probably just where this one lives permanently. Not something I'll get over exactly, just something I'll carry in a way that gets lighter over time without ever fully going away. I don't think I'll feel that specific way around someone again, like that exact combination in those exact proportions. I might feel something else that's its own version of real and good, and I hope I do. But that specific thing, what it felt like to be around her, I think that was particular to her and to that time and to who I was in it. And I'm okay with that mostly. Some things are supposed to be unrepeatable. That one just cost more than I expected it to. There's a difference between knowing something and accepting it. I knew pretty early that the timing was wrong. I knew it in the way you know something you don't want to know. The way it sits in the back of your head and you keep walking past it without looking directly at it, because looking directly at it means having to deal with it. And I was very good at not looking directly at it for a while. I got comfortable in the space between knowing and accepting, which is its own kind of place to live. Uncomfortable in a specific way, but also protected from the full weight of what's actually true. The circumstances were real and they weren't going away. I'm not going to go into every specific detail because some of it is personal in a way I want to keep personal, but the broad shape of it was this. We were both at points in our lives where the things pulling us in different directions were serious things. Not excuses, not the kind of obstacles you push through because the feeling is strong enough. Real things. The kind of things that don't bend just because you want them to. And I think I understood that from the beginning. You know, on some level I always knew I just spent a while choosing not to fully reckon with what I knew. The moment I couldn't avoid it anymore wasn't some big event. It didn't happen because of a conversation or a fight or some external thing that forced the issue. It happened because I was alone one evening, just me in my own head, and I finally let myself look directly at the thing I'd been walking past. Like I just stopped moving for long enough to actually see it. And what I saw was that there was no version of this that worked, given where we both were. I could want it as much as I wanted, and she could feel whatever she felt, and none of that was going to change the actual shape of our actual lives, which were pointed in directions that didn't converge. Not then, maybe not ever, but definitely not then. And sitting with that, actually sitting with it rather than brushing past it, was one of the more uncomfortable things I've done, because it meant accepting that the feeling was real and the situation was impossible and both of those things were true at the same time, and I couldn't fix either of them. I couldn't make myself feel less, and I couldn't make the circumstances different, and so I was just stuck in it, knowing what I knew and feeling what I felt, and not having anywhere to go with either. I think part of what made it so hard to accept was that the problems weren't about us. That's the specific thing about wrong timing. The obstacle isn't the relationship itself. It's not that we were wrong for each other or that something between us was broken. The problem was entirely external, entirely circumstantial, and circumstantial problems feel more unfair than personal ones, in a way that's hard to shake. If there was something wrong between us, I could have worked with that. I could have pointed to it and said, okay, this is why it doesn't work. This is the real reason. But there was nothing wrong between us. The only thing wrong was everything around us, and you can't fix everything around you just by wanting to. I remember the specific quality of that evening when I finally accepted it. The way the room felt, the light, the particular silence of being by yourself with something heavy. I wasn't crying, which surprised me a little. I think I'd expected that the acceptance of it would come with more of an emotional event. Instead, it was just this flat settling in, this quiet arrival at a place I've been approaching for a while without admitting I was approaching it. Like the grief had been building gradually enough that by the time I got there, it didn't have the force of something new. It was more like a confirmation of something I'd already been feeling in pieces. And after that evening, things were different. Not on the outside. The outside looked exactly the same. I still saw her. We still talked. Everything continued the way it had been continuing. But something in how I was experiencing it had shifted. Before that, I could be in it with some part of myself still holding on to the possibility, still keeping a small door open to the idea that maybe the circumstances would change, maybe something would shift, maybe the timing would somehow correct itself. After that, I couldn't do that anymore. The door was closed, and I knew it was closed, and I was now in the situation with my eyes fully open rather than half open. Which sounds like it should be better, and in some ways was, but in other ways was just harder. Because hope, even unrealistic hope, makes things more bearable while it lasts. What I found after accepting it was that I had to make a decision about what to do next that I hadn't had to make before. When I was still half pretending I didn't know, the path forward was just to keep going the way I was going and see what happened. After I knew, really knew, I had to actually choose what I was doing. And the choice I made, which I've questioned since, was to stay in it, to keep being around her, to keep the time we spent together, to not pull back just because I now knew clearly that it wasn't going anywhere. And I made that choice because the alternative, creating distance and letting what we had thin out and eventually disappear, felt worse than the pain of staying, which might have been the wrong calculation, but it was the one I made. And I want to be honest about something regarding that choice, because I think it matters. There was a part of me that was hoping, even after accepting that the timing was wrong, even after closing that door, that something would change. That's the thing about hope, it doesn't die cleanly just because you've decided it should. I told myself I'd accepted it, and in most ways I had. But underneath that acceptance, there was still this small, stubborn thing that hadn't gotten the message, that was still pointing toward her and waiting for the circumstances to rearrange themselves into something that worked. And I carried that small, stubborn thing around for longer than made any sense. And it made the whole thing harder in ways I probably could have avoided if I'd been more honest with myself about it. But that's easier to see now than it was then. Then I was just a person in a situation I hadn't asked for, doing the best I could with the information I had, which mostly meant getting through each day and trying not to let what I was carrying make me worse at being a person. Some days that worked better than others. There was a conversation that never happened between us, and I think about it more than I should. Not constantly, not in a way that runs my life, but it surfaces sometimes, in that way that unfinished things do. And I want to try to describe it because I think the conversation you never have with someone is sometimes more significant than the ones you do. And this one sits in me as an example of that. What I wanted to say to her, what I never said, was pretty simple actually. Not some elaborate confession, not a speech I'd prepared, just the honest thing, that I felt something real for her, that being around her was different from being around anyone else, that I knew the circumstances were what they were, and I wasn't asking her to fix that, wasn't putting any pressure on her, just wanted her to know that what was happening on my side was real, and that she mattered to me in a way that went beyond whatever we were officially calling what we were. That's it. That's the whole conversation I never had, and I thought a lot about why I never had it. The easy answer is fear. The standard version of why people don't say things they should say. Fear of rejection, fear of making things weird, fear of losing what we had by reaching for something more. And all of that was in there. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But I think there was something else too, something slightly more complicated that I've only been able to articulate with enough time between me and it. Part of why I didn't say it was that, saying it would have made the impossibility of the situation more real. Right now, not saying it, I could still live in this space where the feeling existed between us in this unspoken form, where it was present without being named. And there was something about the unnamed version of it that felt more bearable than the named one. Because once you name it, you have to deal with it. Once you say the words out loud, both of you are now in a conversation about the reality of the thing. And the reality of the thing was that the circumstances didn't work, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation explicitly. Wasn't ready to sit across from her and talk about all the reasons this couldn't be what it felt like it should be. So I kept it in, and she, I think, kept whatever she felt in too, and we existed in this space together where both of us probably knew more than we were saying, and neither of us was saying it, and that space was its own kind of thing. Painful in ways, but also oddly intimate, There's a specific intimacy to being in a room with someone and both of you understanding something without either of you naming it. Like you're sharing a secret neither of you has spoken out loud. I've imagined the conversation enough times that I can almost hear how it would have gone. And I know that's a dangerous thing, constructing a conversation in your head that never happened, because your version of it is always going to be shaped by what you wanted rather than what would actually have occurred. My version of the conversation goes, okay. She hears what I say and it lands gently, and she tells me she feels it too. And we have this honest moment of acknowledging the thing between us. And then we talk about the circumstances and agree that it's genuinely impossible, and there's some sadness in that, but also some relief in finally having said it. And then we go back to whatever we were before, except cleaner, except with this acknowledged thing sitting between us, instead of the unacknowledged one. But I have no actual idea if that's how it would have gone. She might have been surprised. She might have felt less than I thought she felt, and my saying it would have made things permanently weird. She might have felt exactly what I thought she felt, and it would have been as sad and relieving as I imagined, and then things would have been different in ways I can't predict. I don't know. That's the thing about conversations you never have. You never get to find out how they actually go. You just get to sit with your version of them indefinitely. The timing question comes up a lot when I think about this. Like, was there ever a moment where I could have said it? And honestly, yes. There were moments. There were evenings where the conversation got close enough that stepping across the line would have been natural, where something in the atmosphere was open enough that if I had said the thing, it wouldn't have come from nowhere. And I felt those moments. I was aware of them while they were happening, and I let them pass, every single one of them. Felt them open and close without walking through them, which is something I've done enough times in my life that it's starting to feel like a pattern I should probably look at more seriously. I think part of the reason I let them pass beyond everything I've already said is that I didn't want to be the person who made it sad. Right now, in those moments, everything was good. The conversation was good, being there was good, and I knew that saying the thing would shift the register of the whole evening from good into something more complicated and heavy, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be responsible for taking something that felt light and making it heavy. Even if the heaviness was honest, even if it was necessary, I couldn't make myself be the one to introduce it into a moment that was otherwise okay, which is its own kind of selfishness, actually. And I've recognized that sense. Because what I was protecting in those moments wasn't really the evening or even her experience of it. I was protecting myself from having to sit in the discomfort of saying a real thing and waiting to see what happened to it. The not saying it felt like keeping something safe, but what I was actually keeping safe was me, not the situation. And the situation didn't benefit from my silence. It just continued unresolved. There's a version of me that said it. I think about that version sometimes. He was braver than I was, or maybe just more tired of carrying it. And he looked at her in one of those open moments and just said the actual thing and found out how it landed. And I genuinely don't know if his version of events went better than mine. Maybe it made everything worse. Maybe it gave both of them something to close the door on properly rather than leaving it in this permanent, half-open state. I can't know. I just know he got to find out, and I didn't. And there are days when that feels like a significant thing to have missed. The conversation not happening didn't make the feeling go away. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes people imagine that swallowing something is the same as resolving it. That if you don't say the thing, it stops being real. It doesn't. It just stays in you with nowhere to go. And feelings that have nowhere to go tend to find places to leak out in ways you didn't intend. I don't know exactly how it leaked out in my case, whether she could see it sometimes, whether it changed how I was around her in ways that were visible, even though the words were never said. I hope not. But I genuinely can't be certain, and now it just lives as the conversation that never happened. One of the things I left behind in that period that I didn't get to finish or close or resolve. It doesn't haunt me exactly, that's too strong a word for what it does. It just sits there, occasionally surfacing, this small piece of unfinished business with a person who has probably moved on and doesn't think about it at all, if she ever thought about it, which I don't know. That not knowing is its own thing. One of many things about this that I never got answers to and probably never will. I've been talking about what didn't happen and what couldn't happen, and I want to spend some time on what actually did, because something did. It wasn't nothing. Whatever the circumstances were, whatever the ceiling was on where it could go, there was something real in the space we occupied together, and I think not acknowledging that would be its own kind of dishonest. What we had was time, real time, actual hours spent together in a way that mattered. And I think time is underrated as a thing two people can give each other. Not just the quantity of it, but the quality, the way it was spent, the texture of those hours. We had conversations that went places I didn't expect. You know, the kind that start somewhere ordinary and end up somewhere you couldn't have predicted when you sat down. We had evenings that felt complete in themselves, not like they were missing something, not like they were just a version of something better that couldn't exist. They were good on their own terms, and I think that's worth saying clearly. There was an ease to being around her that I've already tried to describe, but that showed up in small specific ways that I haven't mentioned yet. The way we could be quiet together without it being weird, which sounds like a small thing, but isn't. The way certain jokes became recurring things between us, references that only made sense if you'd been there for the original moment, which is one of the ways you know something real is being built between two people. The way she'd remember things I mentioned in passing and bring them up later, which told me she was actually listening and not just performing listening, and which made me feel seen in the specific way you feel seen when someone holds onto something small about you. We had moments that I filed away while they were happening because I knew even then that I was going to want them later. A specific evening walk where the conversation went somewhere unusually honest and we both said things we didn't usually say to people. A night where we stayed somewhere much later than we planned to, and neither of us acknowledged that we were both choosing to stay. Just kept finding the next thing to talk about. Kept not leaving. Small things. The specific way she'd look at me sometimes when I said something that landed. This expression that was partly amused and partly something else that I couldn't fully read, but that I liked seeing. These are the things that accumulate into something, that build up over time into a version of closeness that has its own reality, even when it doesn't have a category. And I think that's what we had, a closeness that didn't have a category. Something that lived in the space between friendship and something more without being fully either one. And that space has its own particular quality that I found hard to describe to people who haven't been in it. It's warmer than friendship, but it's also sadder because you're both aware, at least I was, of what it's adjacent to and can't be. And that awareness puts a tinge on everything that friendship doesn't have. Not enough to ruin it. The time together was genuinely good, but enough that you're never completely inside the moment without also being slightly outside it, looking at what it isn't. I want to say something about what it meant to have that, even in the form it came in, because I think there's a version of this story where I frame everything we had as a consolation prize, as the lesser version of what I actually wanted. And I don't think that's quite right. What we had was its own thing and it had its own value. And I don't want to reduce it to just the shadow of something that couldn't happen. The conversations were real. The time was real. The way she made me feel when I was around her was real. None of that was diminished by the fact that it couldn't become something more. If anything, knowing the ceiling was where it was made me more present in what we actually had, more attentive to it, less likely to take it for granted the way you sometimes take things for granted when you assume they're going to be around indefinitely. There's a kind of gratitude that coexists with the grief in situations like this that I find hard to explain, but that's genuinely there. I'm grateful for the time. I'm grateful for the conversations and the evenings and the specific texture of being around her that I've tried to describe in previous chapters. I'm grateful that it happened at all, that I got to know her and feel what I felt and have the hours we had, even knowing the cost of all of it. And the gratitude and the grief aren't in opposition to each other. They're just both present, occupying the same space, neither one canceling the other out, which I think is actually the most honest way to hold an experience like this, when you can get there. Not collapsing it into either the good or the bad, but letting both of them be true simultaneously. The thing I notice when I think about what we had is that I don't wish it hadn't happened. That's maybe the simplest and most honest thing I can say about it. I went through the grief of losing it. I carried the weight of the feeling for a long time after it was over, and I still don't wish it hadn't happened. Because the alternative, a version of that period of my life without her in it, feels genuinely emptier than the version I got. The version I got had her in it, and it had what we built in that limited space, and it had all those hours that felt like something. And I'd rather have those things and the grief that came after them than have avoided both by never being in it at all. I think that's the thing about something real, even when it's complicated and painful, and ultimately limited in what it can be. The reality of it is worth something that the safer version of the same period, without the risk and the feeling and the loss, simply wouldn't have had. And I'd rather have lived in something real, even a real thing that couldn't go where it should have gone, than in the comfortable, uncomplicated version where I felt less and lost less, and also just had less. That's not a lesson I'm trying to teach anyone. It's just where I've landed when I look at it honestly, which is that what we had, limited as it was, mattered, and I'm glad I was in it. There's this other thing that was happening around me during all of this that I haven't talked about yet, and that made everything harder in a specific way, and that's watching other people be with someone just because the timing worked out. Not because it was right, not because the person was right, just because the circumstances lined up and so they were together. And I want to talk about that because I think it's one of the more quietly painful parts of being in a right person, wrong time situation that doesn't get acknowledged enough. I'd look around at people I knew who were in relationships, and I'd notice, I'd actually look at what they had and try to assess it honestly. And some of them had something real, something that was clearly both the right person and the right time, and those people I could just feel happy for without it costing me anything. But some of them were clearly just in the right time situation, together because they were in the same place at the same moment in their lives, because the circumstances made it easy, because neither of them had anything major pulling them in a different direction, and so they defaulted toward each other and called it something. And watching that while I was sitting with what I had with her, which was so clearly the right person and so clearly the wrong time, was its own specific kind of difficult. And I want to be careful here because I'm not trying to say those relationships weren't real or didn't matter to the people in them. I don't know what's inside anyone else's relationship from the outside, and I'm aware of that. But there was something about seeing people together who you could tell were together primarily because of convenience, because of proximity and timing and circumstance, while you were sitting with something that felt genuinely rare but couldn't go anywhere, that produced a specific kind of frustration that I didn't always know what to do with. Because the universe doesn't reward the feeling. That's the thing I kept running into. You'd think, on some level, that if the feeling is real enough and rare enough, it would find a way. That there'd be some organizing principle at work that makes the right person and the right time eventually converge for the people who are supposed to be together. And there isn't. The universe is completely indifferent to whether what you have is real or convenient. Timing is just timing. It doesn't know what you feel, and it doesn't care. And so you end up with people who feel something genuine and rare, being kept apart by circumstances, while other people end up together by accident of proximity. And there's no justice in that, and no logic to it, and there's nothing you can do about it. I had a friend at the time who got into a relationship during this period, and again, I want to be careful because he's a good person, and I don't know everything about what he had with her, but from the outside, it looked like something that happened because the moment was right, more than because the person was right. They were both available, they were both in the same social circle, the conditions were favorable, and so it happened. And I remember sitting across from him at some point while he talked about it, this new thing he was in, and feeling this complicated mix of being genuinely happy for him, and also this low-level ache that I couldn't fully justify and couldn't make go away. Because he got to just have it, you know. He got to be in something, actually in something, moving forward with someone, doing all the ordinary relationship things that become extraordinary when you're with the right person, but that he was doing with someone where I wasn't sure the person was right, just the timing. And I had this thing with her that felt more real than anything I'd felt before, and I couldn't do any of those ordinary things with it. And the unfairness of that comparison is not something I'm proud of sitting with. But it was there, and pretending it wasn't would be dishonest. There's also a version of this that happened in my own head rather than through watching other people, which is that I'd sometimes think about what it would look like if I just did what those people were doing. If I just found someone where the timing was right and let the circumstances do the work and stopped holding out for the thing I had with her that I couldn't have. And I thought about it seriously, not as an abstract exercise, but as an actual option. Just go find someone where it's easy, where nothing is in the way, where you can just be with someone without it being complicated. And the thought would last for about 30 seconds before I'd feel how hollow it was and abandon it. Because I knew what the real thing felt like now. That was the problem. Before her, I could have done the convenient thing without knowing what I was trading away, without having a reference point for what it was supposed to feel like. But now I had a reference point and it was specific and real, and the convenient thing felt like a pale version of it that I couldn't make myself want just because it was available. Which is its own kind of curse, knowing what the real thing feels like. It makes the convenient version feel worse than it would have if you'd never felt the real thing at all. And I think this is one of the genuinely hard things about the right person, wrong time situation that doesn't get enough conversation. The way it recalibrates you, the way having felt something real and not being able to have it changes your relationship to everything that comes after. Because you're now measuring things against something that was real and that was also exceptional. And most things don't measure up to exceptional. That's what makes exceptional exceptional. And so you end up more selective in a way that's not about being picky or having unrealistic standards. It's just about knowing from experience what something real actually feels like and not being able to pretend that other things are that when they're not. I don't think I regret that recalibration, even though it made things harder. I'd rather know what real feels like and have to hold out for it again than not know and settle for convenient out of ignorance. But I want to be honest that it cost something. That sitting in the wrong person, right time world while carrying the right person, wrong time experience is genuinely uncomfortable in ways I hadn't anticipated. You feel like everyone else is playing a different game with different rules, and you're the only one who got handed the complicated version. And maybe that's not fair either. Maybe the people in the convenient relationships have their own version of this that I can't see from where I'm standing. But from where I was standing, for a while it really felt that way. And the feeling passed eventually. Most feelings do, if you wait them out long enough. But while it was present fully. That specific combination of longing for what I had and couldn't have, and frustration at watching other people have things I didn't want but could have had if I'd been willing to lower the bar. Which I wasn't. Which I'm still not, honestly. And I think that's okay. I think holding out for the real thing is okay even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it takes longer than you'd like and costs more than you expected. The alternative is just a longer and slower version of not having what you actually need. And I'd rather have the discomfort of holding out than the different discomfort of being with someone and knowing it isn't right. There's a specific experience that I haven't fully described yet, and it's maybe the strangest part of all of this, which is being inside something while simultaneously watching it not become what it should be. Not from the outside, not in retrospect, but in real time while you're still in it, still showing up, still having the hours together. You're present in something good, and you're watching it stay limited, and you're doing both of those things at the same time, and the combination is genuinely hard to sit in. I'd be in the middle of a good evening with her, and there'd be this moment, sometimes just a few seconds, where I'd see clearly what the evening was and what it wasn't, where I'd feel the full weight of the feeling and the full weight of the ceiling at the same time, and the gap between those two things would be right there. Not abstract, not something I was thinking about theoretically, but actually present in the moment I was in. And then I'd push it back down and return to the conversation and keep being a normal person in the room, but it had been there, that awareness, and it changed the quality of the moment slightly even after it receded. It's like, you know how sometimes you're having a genuinely good time and you become aware that it's going to end, that the evening is finite, and that awareness puts a slight shade on the enjoyment without actually ruining it. It's still good, but there's this slight elegiac quality to it now, this knowing that it won't last. What I was experiencing was something like that, but bigger and more permanent. Not that the evening was going to end, but that the whole thing was going to end. That this specific version of being in her life and her being in mine was temporary in a way I couldn't fix. And that awareness was always there underneath everything. Never fully gone. Just more or less loud, depending on the moment. And there were specific instances where it was louder, where something happened or was said that brought the ceiling into focus in a way I couldn't look away from. A moment where she mentioned something about her future plans, and I realized how little overlap there was with mine. A conversation where the life she was building became visible in its specifics, and I could see clearly that I wasn't in it. Not in any sustained way, not in the way that would have mattered. Those moments were the hardest because they turned the abstract thing, the timing is wrong, into something concrete and detailed that I had to actually look at. I remember one specific evening that I think about more than the others. We were having a genuinely good time. The conversation was easy and honest, and at some point she said something about where she was going to be in a year, and the specific way she said it, the certainty of it, the completeness of the picture she had of her own future landed in me like something heavy, because her future was so real and so formed, and I just wasn't in it, not as anything that counted. And I sat there for a second holding that, and then put it away and kept talking And she never knew that anything had shifted for me in that moment. But it had. It really had. The watching it not become what it could have been also happened in smaller ways that accumulated over time. Every moment where the conversation could have gone somewhere more honest and didn't. Every time I felt the thing I felt and kept it off my face. Every instance of holding back what I actually wanted to say, because saying it would have changed the register of everything, and I wasn't ready to do that. All of those small moments of choosing the version of things that kept everything intact over the version that might have actually addressed what was happening, they added up. They built into this long experience of being present in something while also withholding something fundamental about how I was experiencing it. And that's a tiring way to exist, you know. It costs something over time, even when each individual instance feels manageable. There was also this thing that happened where I'd get a glimpse of what it could have been under different circumstances. A moment that had the quality of something more. A conversation that went somewhere that felt like what the real version of this would feel like if the real version were possible. And those glimpses were their own kind of painful, because they made the potential concrete. It wasn't just theoretical anymore, just an abstract idea that things could have been different. In those moments, I could actually feel what different would have felt like, and then the moment would pass, and I'd be back in the actual version of things, which was real and good, but also not that. And the distance between what I'd just glimpsed and what I was back in was something I'd have to adjust to all over again. I think what made it specifically hard was that there was no natural endpoint I could orient toward. With most difficult situations, you can see the finish line even if it's far away. You know this phase ends when this thing happens, and you hold on to that. But with this, I couldn't see a finish line because I hadn't decided to end anything. I was still in it, still choosing to be in it, still showing up, and so the experience of watching it not become what it could have been was open-ended. It didn't have a scheduled conclusion. It just continued day after day, good and limited simultaneously, with no particular moment where I was going to arrive at a resolution. And alongside all of that, there was this grief that I was experiencing in advance, like I was already mourning something while it was still happening, already feeling the loss of it before the loss had actually arrived, because I knew it was coming. I knew that the circumstances were what they were, and that eventually they were going to pull us in different directions, and that the time we had was finite in a way that I couldn't change. And so part of me was already grieving, while another part was still trying to just be present and enjoy what we had. And those two things don't coexist easily. The grief kept leaking into the enjoyment, and the enjoyment kept making the grief sharper, because it kept reminding me of what I was going to lose. I don't know if there's a way to be in a situation like this without experiencing it that way. Maybe some people manage to completely compartmentalize, to just be in the good thing while it's good, and deal with the loss when it comes, rather than in advance. I couldn't do that. I'm not built that way. I think my brain doesn't know how to be fully in something without also being aware of its edges, aware of where it ends. And in this situation, the edges were very present and very sharp, and I was aware of them constantly, even when I was trying not to be. What I'm left with when I think about this chapter of it is this strange mixture of it having been genuinely good and also genuinely hard at the same time, in the same moments, not good and then hard sequentially, but both simultaneously, which is a specific kind of emotional experience that I think only certain situations produce, where the thing you're in is actually wonderful, and the fact of it being wonderful is also what makes it painful, because you can see clearly what it is and what it can't be, and both of those things are vivid and present and real. And I was in that for a while, longer than I should have probably, longer than was good for me, but also I'm not sure I'd have chosen differently even knowing that, because the alternative was leaving something that was real and good, and I couldn't make myself do that before I had to. At some point you have to figure out what to do with something you can't act on. the feeling was real, and it wasn't going anywhere, and the situation wasn't changing. And I was still showing up and still feeling it every time I saw her, and I had to put it somewhere. You can't just feel something that size and have it sit there inert. It needs somewhere to go, and when the obvious place it should go is closed off, you find other places for it, some of them better than others. The first thing I did, honestly, was nothing. I just carried it, which sounds passive, and it was, but I think there's a period in every situation like this where doing nothing is actually the only thing available to you. You're still figuring out the shape of what you're in, still calibrating to the reality of it, and the carrying without doing anything with it is part of that process. I walked around with it for a while, just letting it be what it was, not trying to fix it or process it or turn it into anything. Just feeling it and going about my days and letting the weight of it become familiar. The problem with that approach is that it has a shelf life. You can carry something without addressing it for a while, and then the carrying starts to cost more than it used to, and you need to do something else with it. And I reached that point somewhere in the middle of all of this, where just carrying it was starting to feel like it was taking up too much of me, starting to leak into parts of my life it wasn't supposed to touch. I'd be somewhere completely unrelated to her, and the feeling would just be there, not invited, not triggered by anything particular, just present, taking up space that was supposed to be available for other things. So I started talking about it, not to her, not directly, but to one person who I trusted enough to let see it. And I want to say something about that because I've talked in other videos about how I tend to keep things to myself, how I find it hard to tell people what's going on inside. And this was one of the times I actually managed to not do that. I told one person the shape of what I was in. Not every detail, not the full version, but enough that someone else knew what I was carrying, and I wasn't completely alone in it anymore. And that helped in a specific way that I don't think I could have predicted. Because it wasn't like the other person could fix anything or change anything. They just knew. And just being known in something, having one person who understood what was happening with me, made the carrying lighter in a way that I didn't expect. I also threw myself into things. This is probably the most cliched version of what people do with feelings they can't act on. And I'm including it because it's cliched, because it's true. I got more focused on things that were mine, on the parts of my life that were actually available to me, and that didn't have ceilings on them the way this did. Not as a distraction exactly, more like a reorientation. Putting energy into things where the energy could actually go somewhere rather than into something where it had nowhere to go. And that helped too, not by making the feeling smaller, but by making the rest of my life feel bigger, which amounts to the same thing in practice. There were also, I'll be honest, some nights where I just sat in it, where I didn't try to do anything productive with the feeling, didn't try to process it or redirect it or make something of it, just let it be fully present and felt it completely and let that be the whole evening. And those nights were hard, but they were also real in a way that the distracted version wasn't. And I think there's something necessary about sitting in a feeling without trying to manage it, just letting it exist at its full size without immediately trying to reduce it. You can't skip that part. Or you can try, but it just comes back later at a less convenient time. So you might as well let it happen when you're prepared for it. I wrote some things. I don't really talk about this publicly, but I'm including it because it's true, and because I think it mattered. Not formally, not with any intention of it becoming anything, just privately putting words to what I was carrying as a way of getting it out of me and into some external form, where I could look at it. And there's something about the act of writing that does something to a feeling that just thinking about it doesn't do. When it's in your head, it can be formless and overwhelming. It can feel bigger than it actually is, because you can't see its edges. When you put it into words, it has shape. You can see where it starts and ends. And seeing its shape made it feel more manageable, like something with boundaries rather than something that could expand indefinitely. I also found myself paying more attention to music during that period than I usually do, in that specific way where a song gets into you because it's describing something you're in the middle of, not looking for songs that matched the feeling, not curating a playlist about it, or anything like that. Just listening to whatever I was listening to and finding that certain things landed differently than they would have in a different period. And there's something about music meeting you in a feeling that I've talked about elsewhere, but that I'll mention here because it was genuinely part of what got me through some of the harder parts of this. Not fixing anything, just company. Just the feeling of not being completely alone in something because somewhere, someone had felt this too and made something out of it. The honest answer about what I did with the feeling is that I didn't do anything particularly elegant with it. I carried it, and sometimes I talked about it, and sometimes I sat in it, and sometimes I threw myself into other things, and sometimes I did nothing at all and just let the days pass and waited for things to shift on their own. And all of those things contributed in some proportion to getting through it, and none of them solved it, because this isn't the kind of thing that gets solved. It's the kind of thing that gets lived through, and living through something is messier and less linear than solving something. It involves going backwards sometimes and sideways and occasionally sitting completely still. And that's just what it looks like from the inside when you're in it. What I know is that the feeling didn't break me. It cost me things, and it changed me in ways I've already talked about and I'm still talking about. But it didn't break me, and I don't think it diminished me either. If anything, I think going through something real and feeling it fully and not running from it built something in me that I didn't have before. Not wisdom exactly, I'm reluctant to call it that. More like a tolerance for difficulty that comes from having been in something difficult and come out the other side still intact. And that tolerance, that knowledge that I can carry something heavy and keep moving, is something I couldn't have gotten any other way. You don't learn it in theory. You learn it by carrying the thing. The ending wasn't a single moment. I want to say that first because I think people imagine endings as these clear, defined events, a conversation that closes something, a day you can point to and say, that was when it was over. And sometimes endings are like that, but this one wasn't. This one was more like a gradual loosening, a slow pulling apart that happened over weeks, in a way that I kept not quite acknowledging until the distance was already there, and I was looking back at it rather than watching it happen. Part of that was the circumstances, doing what circumstances do. Things in both our lives were moving. The things that had made the timing wrong were asserting themselves more loudly, and the natural result of that was less time together. Less of the easy contact that had made everything feel close, even when it wasn't officially anything. And when you take away the regular time, the ordinary contact, the default presence of someone in your days, what's left is this absence that fills up the space where the person used to be, and that is its own specific kind of hard to sit with. I remember the last time I saw her properly, and I knew going into it that it was probably the last time, at least for a while, at least in the form that had mattered. There was something in the air of that day that had a quality to it. You know, that particular quality that endings have when both people are aware of them, even if neither person is saying it. We were both there, both present, both doing the normal things we did together, and underneath all of it was this unspoken knowledge that this was a version of goodbye. And I held that knowledge the whole day without letting it change anything on the surface, because I didn't want the day to become about the ending. I wanted it to just be what it was for as long as it could be. And it was good. That's the thing that stays with me. The last proper time I spent with her was genuinely good, easy, and real and warm, in all the ways that time with her had always been. And I'm glad for that. You know, I'm glad the last version of it was good rather than difficult or awkward or already faded into something lesser than what it had been. It ended at its best, which is what right person, wrong time does. It ends before it has the chance to become anything worse than it was. And there's something both beautiful and painful about that. Beautiful, because what you're left with is the intact version, the good version, nothing soured by a bad ending. Painful for exactly the same reason. We said goodbye in the normal way, the way you say goodbye to someone when you're pretending it's not as significant as it is. The kind of goodbye that's calibrated to match what things officially were between you rather than what they actually were. And I walked away and I felt the full weight of it arrive almost immediately, like it had been waiting just outside the door for the moment I stepped through it. Everything I'd been holding in while I was with her, the awareness of what was ending, the grief that had been building in advance, all of it just landed at once when I was finally alone with it. And then there was just the absence, which is the thing that's hardest to describe because it's defined by what isn't there rather than what is. The absence of the text that used to come, the absence of the plans that used to get made, the absence of that particular quality of having someone in your days whose presence you'd built around without quite noticing, and then suddenly they're not there. And everything that had organized itself around them has to reorganize around the gap. And gaps are harder to live around than presences, because a presence has a specific shape, but a gap is just empty, and emptiness expands to fill whatever space you give it. I kept reaching for my phone in the first few days after, not even consciously, just this automatic reaching, the habit of contact that had built up over the time we'd had, and that didn't stop just because the context for it was gone. I'd pick up my phone and start to do the thing and then remember and put it back down. And that small, repeated motion, that reaching and stopping, was its own specific kind of grief that happened in these tiny moments throughout the day, rather than in one big wave, which I think is actually the harder version. Because there's no single event to process, just this constant low-level reminder distributed across ordinary moments that she wasn't there anymore. I want to talk about what the grief actually felt like, because I think the grief of losing something that was never technically together is different from the grief of a regular ending. With a regular breakup, you have a defined thing that has ended, and you grieve the defined thing. There's a category for it. People understand it. The loss has clear edges. With this, the grief doesn't have a category. You can't tell people you're going through a breakup because you weren't together. You can't explain the weight of it without also explaining the whole complicated context. And even then, people sometimes struggle to understand why you're as affected as you are by something that was never official. And so there's this additional layer to the grief, which is the grief of not being able to fully grieve it, of carrying something real, and not having a sanctioned space to put it down in. Not having the vocabulary that makes other people understand and give you the room you need. You're sad about something that most people around you don't have the full picture of, and the few who do still might not entirely grasp why it hits as hard as it does. Because the metrics they're used to applying, how long were you together, how serious was it, don't capture what makes this particular kind of loss actually hard. What I lost wasn't a relationship in the conventional sense. What I lost was the possibility, the door that had technically been open, even if I couldn't walk through it, was now closed. The version of the future where circumstances somehow changed and the timing corrected itself, and it became something was no longer even theoretically available. And losing a possibility is a strange thing to grieve, because it was never concrete, never something you actually had, and yet the loss of it is completely real and leaves a real absence behind. You're mourning a future that never happened, and that's a harder kind of mourning than mourning something that did happen, because there's nothing specific to point to, nothing to hold in your hands and look at and say, yes, this is what I had and what I lost. I got through the first few weeks the way you get through things when you don't have another option, which is just by continuing, waking up and getting through the day and going to sleep and doing it again. Not elegantly, not with any particular strategy, just by letting time pass, because time passing was the only thing available to me. And slowly, in the way that things do shift slowly when you stop trying to force them, it did start to change. The absence became familiar. The reaching for my phone and stopping became less frequent. The weight of it started to have a texture I recognized, rather than one that surprised me every morning. And there's something about familiarity with pain that makes it more manageable, even when it doesn't make it smaller. I don't think I've fully described what the ending was, because I'm not sure I fully know. It happened gradually enough that I can't draw a clean line through it. But I know what it left behind, which is this place I've arrived at where it's over. And I know it's over, and I've accepted that it's over, and I still carry something from it that I suspect I always will. Not the sharp version of it, not the grief that was present in the immediate aftermath, just the quiet version, the settled version, the version that has become part of the general texture of who I am and how I understand things, rather than something that's actively happening to me. That's where the ending left me, and I'm still here, which I think is the most honest thing I can say about it. There was a specific night when I finally told someone the whole thing, not a version of it, not the edited form where you give someone enough that they stop asking without giving them the real thing. The actual thing, the full shape of it, what she was and what I felt and what the circumstances were and what it cost me. And I want to talk about that night because I think it was its own significant moment in this whole experience, separate from everything that happened with her, something that mattered in a different way. The person I told was one of my closest friends, and the reason it was him specifically is that he's one of the few people I trust to just receive something without immediately trying to fix it or reframe it or redirect it towards something more manageable. Most people, when you tell them something difficult, go almost immediately into solution mode. They start offering perspectives, suggesting things you could do, finding the angle on it that makes it more okay than it actually is. And I understand why. It's uncomfortable to sit with someone in something painful when you can't make it better. And offering solutions is a way of doing something with that discomfort. But it's not what you need when you're in the middle of something like this. What you need is someone who can just sit in it with you without trying to move it anywhere. He was that, which is why it was him. I'd been carrying it alone for a long time by the point I finally told him. Long enough that it had built up considerable weight. Long enough that I'd gotten used to the weight and stopped noticing how heavy it had become until I was in the middle of telling him, and felt it start to lift slightly and realized how much I'd been holding. That specific feeling of something leaving your chest as you say it out loud is something I hadn't expected and that I still think about. Because I told myself the carrying alone was fine, had convinced myself that I was managing it okay. And then the moment I started talking, I realized that managing it okay and carrying it well are not the same thing. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I think if I'd planned it, I would have talked myself out of it, found some reason why this wasn't the right moment, or why he didn't need to hear all of it, or why I could keep handling it myself for a while longer. The way it came out was that we were talking about something else entirely, and there was a moment where I could feel the conversation adjacent to the real thing, close enough that crossing over wasn't a big step, and I just crossed over. Said something that opened the door to it, watched his face to see if he was ready to hear it, and when his response made clear that he was, I just told him. And the telling was its own experience. There's something that happens when you put into words something you've only ever had in thought form before. Something about the act of making it into language that changes it slightly. Not the facts of it, the facts don't change, but your relationship to it changes. When it's only in your head, it can be formless and total. It can feel like it's everything, like there's nothing outside of it. When you say it out loud, it becomes a story. And stories have edges. They have beginnings and middles and ends. And the edges make it feel more finite than it did when it was just living inside you, without shape. I told him everything. Who she was, what it was about her specifically, what it felt like to be around her, when I knew the circumstances weren't going to work, the conversation I never had with her, all of it. And he listened the whole way through, without interrupting, without trying to redirect, without doing any of the things that would have made me close back up. He just let me say it, all of it. And when I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I didn't expect, and that I've thought about many times since. He said that it sounded like the realest thing I'd ever told him about. And that landed in a specific way, not because it was comforting exactly. It wasn't particularly comforting in the moment, but because it was accurate. It was the realest thing I'd told him about because it was the realest thing that had happened to me up to that point. And having someone else recognize that, name it clearly in those exact words, did something. It made the thing feel validated in a way it hadn't been before. Because up to that point, it had only existed in my own perception of it, only been real from my own point of view. And when you're the only witness to something, you can start to doubt it after a while, to wonder if you've made it bigger than it was, or if you're being overdone about something that didn't merit it. Having someone else see it and call it real put that doubt somewhere quieter. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't suggest I reach out to her, or that I let it go, or that I give it time, or any of the things people say when they're trying to be helpful and don't know what else to offer. He just acknowledged what I'd said and asked questions that made it clear he was actually trying to understand, rather than just waiting for his turn to respond. And we sat in it together for a while, not trying to resolve anything, just two people occupying a conversation about something difficult and being okay with it staying difficult. I felt different after that night. Not fixed, not like anything had changed about the situation or about what I was carrying, but lighter in a specific way, the way you feel lighter when something you've been holding alone is now being held with someone else. Even if the thing is exactly the same and the other person isn't doing anything with it beyond just knowing about it. The knowing seems to do something on its own, like the weight distributes differently when someone else has their hands on it too. And I want to say something about the timing of when I told him, because I think it's relevant. It took me a long time to tell anyone, way longer than was probably good for me, for all the reasons I talked about in the chapter on carrying it alone. And I think the thing that finally made me say it that particular night with him was less about being ready and more about being tired. Tired of the carrying, tired of the managing, tired of being the only one who knew what was happening with me. And sometimes being tired is more motivating than being ready, because being ready implies some clean internal arrival at a state of openness that I'm not sure exists for people like me, who default toward keeping things in. Being tired is just a resource question. You don't have enough left to keep it in one more day, and so it comes out. I've told a few other people since then, more gradually, in different contexts and different levels of detail, and each time something similar happens, this slight easing of whatever I was carrying, this small relief of being known in something rather than just carrying it invisibly. And I think that's something I learned from this specific situation that I didn't know before it. That being known in your hard things, even when being known doesn't change the hard things, matters more than I'd given it credit for. I used to think that keeping things in was protecting them, keeping them safe and intact and mine. And in some ways it does do that. But what it costs in exchange for that protection is the specific relief of not being alone in something. And that cost is higher than I understood before I experienced the alternative. The night I told him didn't fix anything, the situation was exactly what it was before I said a word, and stayed exactly that way after. She was still who she was, and the circumstances were still what they were, and the ceiling was still where it had always been. Nothing external shifted, but something internal did, something about the carrying of it that mattered enough that I remember that night specifically as a point in this whole experience where something changed, even though on the surface everything stayed the same. And I think that's worth saying clearly. Telling someone doesn't solve anything. It doesn't change the facts of what you're in or make the feeling smaller or resolve the circumstances, but it does something that the solving doesn't do, which is make you less alone in it. And being less alone in it is its own form of relief that I've been depriving myself of for too long out of some combination of habit and pride and the mistaken belief that handling it alone made me better at handling it. It didn't. It just made me lonelier than I needed to be in something that was already hard enough. I still go there sometimes. Not as often as I used to, not with the same frequency or the same intensity, but sometimes, usually when things are quiet and there's nothing else pulling my attention, my brain just goes there on its own, and I let it because trying to stop it has never really worked. And I've stopped pretending it's a problem that needs solving. The what ifs. The version of things where the timing was different. The road I didn't get to walk down and still think about sometimes, even though thinking about it changes nothing. And I know it changes nothing. The most persistent one is the simplest one. What if we'd met earlier? Not years earlier, just enough that the circumstances would have been different, that the things in the way wouldn't have been in the way yet, that the timing would have been right instead of wrong. What if I'd walked into that room 6 months before I did? Or a year? What would have been different? And I know this is a completely unanswerable question, that the version of us that would have existed 6 months earlier would have been different people in different circumstances with different things going on in their lives. And the whole thing might have played out completely differently even with the timing fixed. But I go there anyway. My brain constructs a version of it, and I look at it for a while and feel something about it and then put it away. There's another what if that I find harder to look at directly. What if I had said the thing? The conversation I talked about in an earlier chapter, the one that never happened. What if I'd sat across from her in one of those open moments and just told her what I felt? Not with any expectation, not trying to change anything, just saying it. What would she have said? What would have changed? Would anything have been different about how it ended? Would the ending have felt more closed, more resolved, less like something left permanently open? I don't know the answer and I can't know it. And that not knowing is one of the things about this whole experience that I carry most consistently. The what if I find most interesting, in a painful sort of way, is what if the circumstances had changed? Not what if we'd met earlier, but what if something had shifted in the actual conditions of our lives that made it possible? What if the things that were in the way had moved? And this one is interesting because it's the most concrete version, the one where who we were doesn't change, just the circumstances around us. And I can construct it with more detail than the others because I have more material for it. I know what being around her was like. I know what the feeling was. And I can imagine the version of things where none of the external obstacles existed, and we just got to find out what that became. And that version is the one that sits in me most heavily because it's the most plausible, the most like something that could have actually happened. And that proximity to possible makes it more painful than the more theoretical what ifs. I've tried to understand why I go to these places at all, given that they're demonstrably not helpful. Going there doesn't change anything, and it doesn't feel good exactly. It has this bittersweet quality where the constructed version of things feels warm for a moment, and then you return to the actual version, and the contrast is there. And yet, I keep going. And I think the honest answer is that the what-ifs are a way of honoring what the thing actually was. Like my brain won't let go of the fact that it was real and significant by accepting the ending completely. The what-ifs are a refusal, a small, quiet refusal to let the circumstances have the final word on something that deserved more than the circumstances allowed it to have. There's also something in the what-ifs that functions like keeping the feeling alive. As long as I'm still thinking about how it could have gone differently, still constructing the version where it worked, there's still something present. The feeling is still alive in some form, even if only as a hypothetical. And letting go of the what-ifs entirely would feel like the final closing of something, like agreeing completely that it's over, in a way that feels more definitive than I'm entirely ready for. Which is maybe irrational at this point, but feelings don't respond well to rational timelines, and I've stopped expecting them to. I've talked to people who say they have no regrets, who claim they have made peace with everything in their past completely, who don't have what-ifs about anything significant. And I don't really know what to do with that. Either they're different from me in a way I can't fully access, or they're describing something they've decided to feel rather than something they actually feel, which is its own kind of strategy that I'm not sure is better than what I do. Because I think the what-ifs, as uncomfortable as they are at least honest. They're my brain being honest about the fact that what happened here mattered, and that the way it went was genuinely unfortunate, and that a different version of events would have been better. And I'd rather have that honesty, even when it costs me, than perform a piece I don't actually have. The what-ifs do change over time. Not in frequency necessarily, but in quality, in what they cost me when I go there. Early on, they were genuinely painful. Going there felt like pressing on something bruised, and I'd come back from them feeling worse than when I went in. Now they have a different quality, something more like nostalgia than grief, more like looking at a photograph of something you loved, than looking at an open wound. The warmth is still there when I construct those versions of things, but the sharpness has gone out of it. The edge that used to be there has softened into something more manageable. And I think that softening is what progress actually looks like in something like this. Not the absence of the what ifs, but the changing of what they cost. I don't think I'll ever fully stop going there. And I've made peace with that, mostly. The what ifs about her are part of how I understand that period of my life, part of what it meant and what it was. And trying to excise them would be trying to excise part of something real that happened to me. They're the shadow of the thing, the what ifs. And as long as the thing mattered, the shadow is going to be there in some form. I've just learned to sit with the shadow without it taking over everything else, which is maybe the closest thing to resolution that this kind of experience actually offers. Not the absence of it, but the ability to hold it without being held by it. And if you have your own what ifs about your own version of this, your own right person, wrong time, that you still think about sometimes, I just want to say that I think that's okay. I think the what ifs mean the thing was real. And real things leave marks. And marks are not the same as wounds, even when they're in the same place. I've been sitting with how to write this chapter for a while because I don't want to do the thing where everything gets wrapped up cleanly at the end, where the last section delivers some earned peace that makes the whole thing feel resolved in a way that's satisfying to listen to, but doesn't reflect how this actually works. So I'm going to try to just tell the truth about where I actually am with it, which is messier than a clean ending, but more honest. I'm okay. That's the first thing. And it's true. Not okay in the way where I've processed everything completely and arrived somewhere permanently settled. But okay in the practical sense, that I wake up every day and my life is functional and good in most of the ways that matter. And what I went through with her is not the thing currently running my experience. It's in the background. It's in the past. And most days I don't think about it at all, which would have seemed impossible to me at the height of it. And now just feels like how things are. But okay doesn't mean over. And I think that distinction matters because I've noticed that people tend to treat okay and over as synonyms when they're actually two different things. You can be completely okay and still carry something. You can be living your life well and still have something from your past that sits in a particular place, that you feel sometimes in a particular way that hasn't fully dissolved even though enough time has passed that it probably should have if feelings worked on any kind of reasonable schedule. And that's where I am. Okay. And still carrying something. Both of those things true at the same time. What I carry now is quieter than what I carried before. The acute version of it. The version that was present every day and that colored everything and that had this constant weight to it. That's gone. What's left is something more like a settled awareness, a knowledge of what happened and what it was and what it cost me that lives somewhere in the background of how I understand myself and my history. It's part of my story now, rather than something that's actively happening to me. And that shift from active to settled is significant, even if the thing itself is still there. I think about her occasionally, not as often as I used to, not with the same frequency that characterized those months right after it ended, but sometimes. And when I do, it's not painful in the sharp, immediate way it used to be. It's more like looking at something from a distance, something that's clearly significant, but that you're no longer standing in the middle of. And the distance gives it a different quality. I can think about specific things, specific evenings, specific moments that mattered, and feel something about them that's more like tenderness than grief. Which is, I think, what happens when enough time passes and you've actually done the processing rather than just waited for it to be over. I don't know where she is or what she's doing. We're not in contact, and I've made peace with that, which took longer than I'd like to admit. For a while after it ended, there was this low-level awareness of her existence in the world that I couldn't quite switch off. This background monitoring of what she might be doing and who she might be with and whether she ever thought about any of this. And I've let go of that mostly. Not through any deliberate act of letting go, more through the natural loosening that comes when something isn't being actively fed anymore. The monitoring just stopped being something my brain bothered with when it had enough other things to be doing. What I've taken from it, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to make this into a lesson. It's not a lesson, it's just something that happened and something I learned from it in the way you learn things from experiences without them being designed to teach you anything. What I've taken is a better understanding of what real feels like. I know what it is now to be around someone where everything is right, where the feeling is genuine and specific, and not something I talked myself into. And that knowledge is useful even when it's also a little painful, because it means I have a reference point that I didn't have before. I know what I'm looking for, I know what it feels like when it's there, and I know now that timing is real. That it's not just a polite excuse people use to end things. Not just something you say when you don't want to say the real thing. It's an actual force in people's lives, and it's genuinely indifferent to what you feel. And sometimes it just doesn't cooperate. And that's no one's fault, and there's nothing you can do about it. That sounds like a depressing thing to have learned, but I actually find it more clarifying than depressing. Because if timing is real and sometimes just wrong, then the fact that something didn't work isn't evidence of anything being wrong with the feeling or the people. Sometimes the circumstances are just what they are, and knowing that lets me hold what happened between us without needing to find a reason it failed beyond the actual reason, which is just that the timing was wrong. I'm different than I was before this happened. Not a completely different person, but different in ways that I can trace back to this specific experience. More patient, I think, about things that matter. More willing to feel things fully rather than managing them into something smaller and safer. More aware of the cost of keeping things in, of the specific loneliness of carrying something alone that could be carried with someone. All of those things I know differently now than I did before, and I know them differently because of this, because of her, because of what it cost me and what I had to figure out in the carrying of it. There are days when I'm grateful for the whole thing in a way that feels genuine rather than performed. Not grateful that it hurt, not grateful that the timing was wrong, but grateful that I got to feel something real. That I know what that's like, that I'm not someone who has only ever had the convenient version of things and doesn't know the difference. The real thing, even in the limited form I got it, was worth having. I've said that before in the script, and I mean it every time I say it. Not as comfort, not as a way of making peace with something painful, just as an honest assessment. It was worth it. And if you're listening to this from inside your own version of it, from inside the acute phase where everything is still sharp and present and the grief is still the main thing, I want to say something that I mean genuinely and not as a performance of optimism. You're going to get to this chapter. Not on any particular schedule, not by doing anything specific, just by continuing to live your life and letting time do what time does. The chapter where it's settled, the chapter where you're carrying something that used to be heavy and it's lighter now, not gone, just lighter. You're going to get there, and the person you are on the other side of it is going to understand things about love and loss and timing and yourself that you can't access from where you are right now. That's not a small thing. That's actually one of the more significant things a person can have, and you're going to have it right person, wrong time. I understand it now. I wish I didn't some days, but I understand it. And if you're in it too, I'm sorry. It's one of the harder ones, but you're going to be okay.